תודה. אז להמשיך את הגיוון, אני אדבר לרוב באנגלית, אבל הרב דיבר באנגלית בעברית. Okay, so this paper I'm working on with Ellie Fisher, who can't be here, is really part of a larger project on the nature and structure of halachic change. As late, we've been interested in the question of what we're calling the halacha of galut, and to keep it from getting too spicy, the halacha of post-galut, which can, of course, take on many meanings. To borrow from the terminology of the day, we see galut as a structure, not an event. It means it's part of the conceptual framing for understanding the gap between an ideal halacha found in the authoritative sources and the halacha that's actually realized in practice. Maybe the very early example of this is the Gemara says, the Rambam Paskins, that Yovel doesn't apply once the 2.5 Shvatim of Gad and Reuven and half of Menashe were in Nigleh, right? So that the point is, this is well before what we typically think of as, quote, Galut. But even then, that's a way to explain why there's an ideal of Yovel and that Yovel is not applied. Of course, the Yom Tov Shmoneh Esrei starts, Mipnei Chateinu Galinu Ma'artzenu V'Trachaknu Al Matenu. That's a narrative through which we explain why we're not going to keep the Yom Tov in the way one should. I don't think it's only limited to institutions. I think when we say we're no longer Bucky in Halacha X, or we lost the Masorah for Y, or B'davonenu Arabim, because of the low spiritual state we have, we know where all of these to us are expressions of the Lachan Galut, which means it's not about a time and place, but a rhetoric and structure of argument. Now, for most of history, it didn't really matter so much to tag a halacha as galuti or not, because we lived where we lived, we accepted that, and we prayed for return to optimality. But as the Jewish people have come to return to Eretz Israel, the question about how the halacha of galut should be seen, whether it should then be limited some way to its galut context, or on the flip side, whether at the level of halachic doctrine or rhetoric or philosophy, new changes are warranted with the return to Tzion, comes up. Now, at the extremes, the issue is easy, right? Everybody understands that whatever you think when you come to Israel, the halacha of Truma and Tevel applies. And everyone understands that you can't do certain avodot in the Beit HaMikdash without the building. But in the middle, there's actually a surprisingly broad range of things that we can think about, that should we try to enable idealized performances or not? Should certain concepts developed in the exile continue to be applied, or do they need to be reinterpreted or recast? So our thesis is basically that Rav Aaron saw great significance, of course, in the return of the Jewish people to his land and invested his life in that, but was generally resistant to interpreting halacha along a galut, non-galut binary, and was suspicious of thinking that the return to Zion warrants significant recasting of halachic doctrine or ideology. Now we're going to look at two examples from two very different areas. One, the debate over land sales to non-Jews that happened about 15 years ago. And the second one from someplace totally differently, from questions of sexuality and relationships in marriage. And precisely the distance between those is sort of what we want to talk about. So as probably everybody knows, about 15 years ago, there was the Rabbanim, led by Rav Shmuel Eliyahu of Tzfat, issued a kind of public psak that is prohibited to lease and or sell apartments to non-Jews, but probably Arabs, in Israel. And this caused a sort of big to-do in the Frum media and the Dati media and the national media, etc. Rav Aaron, and I think this is the last time he sort of entered the public fray, wrote a response, and he raised a number of local issues, but then he wrote a paragraph that I want to focus on. I'll read in Hebrew. בנוסף, המסמך כולו בנוי כמעט בלעדית על שיטת הרמב"ם, שבאותה קרובה להיבטים הנידונים בגמרא, הותיר גושפנקה בשולחן ערוך. אמנם כל בר בי רב יודע שבין שיטת הרמב"ם לבין המהלך של בעלי התוספות קיים, this is a phrase we want to focus on, תהיינה הסיבות אשר תהיינה, פער משמעותי. די להלעל בדפים הראשונים במסכת עבודה זרה לגבי איסורים הנדידים שם, etc. So, and then he says, I'm not going to come into decide between the Rambam and Tosfot, but why did you rabbis totally forget that תורת שישנם כלים וחומרים שמאפשרים היתר נעדרת לחלוטין מן המסמך? Now, his invocation of the tradition of the Baalei Tosfot is notable for three reasons. First, in our terminology, not his, this is the Tosfot in the beginning of Avodah Zarah is a classic expression of Galut Halacha, right? The Gemara cites many maximalist approaches to the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, and the Baalei Tosfot, as Rav Aaron says, use sort of every tool in the toolbox to minimize those. Eva, right? Dalchei Shalom, we're politically dependent on them, as well as the sorts of readings that would fall outside what his brother-in-law Chaim Soloveitchik would have called the angle of deflection. And all this contrasts with the Rambam, who tended to paskin more pashtut agbara, and therefore had a much more chamul halacha. Now, second, from a technical perspective, despite this broad debate between the Rambam and Tosfot about these halachot, they don't really disagree on the narrow issue at hand, which is, can you rent or sell property, real estate, to non-Jews in Eretz Israel? On that issue, the Rambam says yes, rent, no, sell. And the Tosfot don't really disagree. Their disagreements relate to something else. So one question is sort of, why is he bringing that up? It's not actually relevant to the narrow question at hand. Third, if we were to think about the easiest path to get there would not be through the Tosfot, but what other people raised, which is through Ger Toshav or through some argument to say it's permitted. So therefore, we became very interested in this citation. Now, the second issue is not a direct contrast, but a comparison between two approaches to sexuality within marriage. Rav Lichtenstein has an article, it was translated to Hebrew, of marriage, relations, and relationship, which is essentially motivated by the following question. We today live in what we'll call a kind of very positive attitude towards sexual relationship within marriage. And Rav Aaron notes that was not the shita of the Rishonim. And is very bothered by this. And really the thrust of the article is, how is it that we are different from the Rishonim, who of course set the agenda? And he basically proposes 4 answers, 3 of them quite conventional, one not so. First, he says that Chazal themselves had a more positive attitude, and to some degree it's the Rishonim who derogate from the vision of Chazal. Then he says, look, there's always minority opinions already in the Rishonim. These are matters of hashkafa and reshut rather than chovah. And then he quotes Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook and a number of Haredi poskim and say, look, there's always sources for a more positive attitude. So other than the first rationale, Rav Aaron uses a fairly standard tools of halachic analysis, and it very much weighs on him heavily sort of how it is that we derogated. Now, this contrasts quite strongly with the treatment from Rav Elazar Melamed in his book on the topic of basically marital relationships, where in his own way he also notices the gap between the current sort of framework and the one found in the past, but applies a very different sort of way of thinking about it. He says, look, fundamentally, the relationship between husband and wife is paradigmed after the relationship between God and Knesset Israel. And in Eretz Israel, in the Geula, or in the land, that relationship is tight and strong, and that is reflected in the sort of way of thinking about gender relationships. We went to Galut, there is Hafrada, ben HaKadosh Baruch Hu leKnesset Israel, and that reflects itself in the halacha. And now that we've returned to our land, and he quotes Yeshayahu, and he quotes, and he sort of makes, and Hosea, these are the two Nevi'im that talk about this, and the relationship, between land and the parallelism, and therefore says we're today in a very different place. So for Rav Aaron, it's very much sort of Talmud, Halacha, Rishonim, and the sense of how are we ruptured in the past. And for Melamed, it's Tanakh, Midrash, Chassidut, and Kabbalah, and a sense of like we've now restored. So in an homage to Rav Aaron's approach to Lamdus, we want to think about 3 or 4 interrelated like Nekudot HaMachloket that might be happening here. So the first, probably the simplest, but Rav Aaron always started with the kind of base level, is what we'd call a Yad Yisrael Tekifa. So already in the beginning of, before statehood in the 1930s, the issue of land sales to non-Jews came up, and Rav Herzog was sort of the opinion that since the state is founded under international law, under the UN, and the international community required the state of Israel to treat Jews and non-Jews equally. This was allowed because fundamentally, ein yad Israel tkifa, and there are certain permission structures, which we would call the classic halacha of galut, that enable kulot in this way. So in that sense, we could see that the rabbis of Tzfat and etc. who wrote this document said, okay, like of course today we're a regional superpower, we're a strong nation, we shouldn't sort of hearken back to that. And then we can see Lichtenstein's having some combination of a factual and a normative disagreement, right? Just how independent is the state from global opinion, and also some discussion of how, what exactly do you need for Yad Yisrael to be Tekifa or not? So we think that's right, but we think it's deeper than that. The second part we would call Shlilat HaGalut, right? To what degree should the experiences of Galut bear relevance upon halacha as we return to Tzion? So the position of the rabbis who wrote that article, and to some degree was that, look, Galut is fundamentally a deviation from the divine plan, so we should bracket it. There was halacha, right? Then there's stuff that happened in Galut. Now we're back. So it's not that they forgot the position of the Tosfot. They simply thought it wasn't relevant. It's too enmeshed in the facticity of Galut to be relevant here. Likewise, Rav Melamed basically says that the sex negativity found within our Masorah should be bracketed by the Galut, and that sort of spawned it. But now that we have come back, that is no longer relevant. So in both these cases, Shlilat HaGalut is not just a theological or cultural paradigm, but also a halachic one. I think Rav Aharon takes the opposite perspective on both. Unlike Rav Melamed, he's at pains to reconcile our practices with the Achronim, with the Rishonim, with Chazal, all of which in some sense, or many of which, were all in the period of Galut. His recurring line is, right, Asher mipiem anu chayim umimem anu shotim, and can't envision that strong of a break. As relate to the Gentile relations that sort of Tosfot is talking about, I think we suggest that he possibly cites this because it's still relevant. Of course, Rav Aharon thought that Galut is a product of sin and that return to the land is one of God's great blessings. But he also thought that halachic concepts such as Mipnei Eva, Darchei Shalom, and the various intersections between Jewish and non-Jewish experiences found in Masachet Avodah Zarah reflect something more than accessions to exile, but become sort of cardinal halachic ideals and values, possibly inflected by a certain experience in Galut, but nevertheless reflect something true about the nature of Torah. Now, beyond the narrowly halachic plane, Rav Aharon's religious humanism, which we heard a lot about and will hear also, is also based on the understanding that the Torah personality has much to learn from non-Jewish society and culture. Rav Aharon was particularly attractive to Christian religious thinkers of the Anglosphere of the 17, 18, 19, and 2000s, as they grappled with issue of conviction, morality, and the challenges of curating a religious persona in a secularizing age. So to appreciate this literature, whether simply at the level of its language and cultural reference, to say nothing more of the more foundational conceptual affinities Rav Aharon maintained, inevitably presumes that the sojourn in Gullus secretes something more enduring to the body of Yahadut that cannot be just simply wished away upon our return. Indeed, across his writings, there's many indications that Rav Aharon sort of takes the opposite move. We should, and I think we heard a lot of this morning, should carry some of these insights developed in that context, not only out of Galut, but into the building and the foundation of how the state of Israel should run. And therefore, his invocation of Tosfot runs parallel with this view that we should be very careful before dismissing the relevance of halacha developed in Galut to the Israeli moment. So the third sort of plane of disagreement might be about halacha and its history, or the relationship between the two. Implicit in the rabbi's letter and implicit in Rav Melamed is a set of ideas, sometimes going under the heading of Torat Eretz Israel, which holds that the return to Tzion restores Jewish existence to its tiv'i state, and can usher in a halachic dispensation here as the Christians use the term, like a new halachic era, where halacha can purify itself from the barnacles that have accumulated onto it over the Galut. And here Rav Aharon, following his father-in-law, the Rav, is at pains to avoid this approach. Of course, in his response, he I think there's an ellipsis there, right? He doesn't explain why Tosfot have a different reading than the Rambam. Tihena sibot asher tihena, even though historical accounts of these differences abound in the literature, and Rav Aaron kind of points to them in different places. And Tosfot here are unusually transparent about how they're being influenced by their circumstance, and yet Rav Aaron seems to bracket that. Likewise, in his article on sexuality, Rav Aaron raises but quickly rejects a historical contextual approach that the reason the Rishonim are different from Chazal is because of where they were, Sufism or scholasticism, as the case may be. For Rav Aaron, once a position is articulated by Gdolei Masorah, it gains independence of its local circumstances and becomes constitutive of the halacha itself. So true, Tosfot may have been a product of Galut in the historical sense, but not in the normal sense, in the normative sense. Now our final leg sort of comes off a bridge, sort of grows from all these, is sort of Rav Aaron's resistance to the binary of Galuti and non-Galuti. Though, right, because fundamentally to divide the world that way is to put brackets and to historicize the question of all the issues that came up in Galut. It's to locate those halachot and those experiences in particular time and place, essentially to historicize it. Now, there's a couple problems here. So first of all, so much of halacha is arguably forged in these circumstances. We're going to start redlining, right? Taking a pencil and saying, this halacha is ideal and this halacha is from the Galut, like Enlid of ourselves. No one knows, the lines are, there's too much of it, etc. Beyond that, the standard academic historicism that Rav Aaron writes against in many places is, I would say, ultimately deflationary of halacha, as was mentioned a few times, and basically most attractive to skeptics. By contrast, a redemptive historicism of a kind of post-Galut halacha or Torah Eretz Israel is actually is motivated, of course, by something very positive: the return to Eretz Israel and all its physical and spiritual dimensions that it creates, and something that Rav Aaron ultimately supported. But this historicism promises to restore glory to halacha and entices religious romantics, not religious skeptics, and religious aspirants. And therefore, maybe it's potentially even more dangerous. In this sense, we could see Rav Melamed's analysis of sexuality within marriage as a sort of object lesson for Rav Aaron's concerns. Rav Melamed grounds his discussion in mythical dimensions of the relation between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Israel and the return to Zion, and therefore sidesteps a task that for Rav Aaron is the essential one, which is the analysis of the Rishonim and what they held and what principles we can draw from it. In other words, how for Rav Aaron halacha fundamentally functions. The fact that this area is the most private area of halacha, and lichora, the furthest removed from areas of public concern that we typically think of as Zionism, right, state, politics, etc., I think for Rav Aaron just demonstrates the scope of potential rupture that can be wrought by dividing halacha into an exilic and post-exilic phases. Thus, in Rav Aaron's writings, he rarely accounts for shifts in halachic currents in terms of exile, but more typically through analysis of halachic principles, which may be illuminated in particular circumstances, but are never fundamentally about them. Tzion is better for all sorts of reasons. It clearly offers physical safety and enables observance of more areas of halacha, but it is not to be preferred because it produces halacha that is more authentic to the true halacha, is what we think Rav Aaron thinks.